Hello again, Javatarians. Today we are going to talk about nested loops. That is to say, when we put one loop inside of another loop. We've seen nested ifs, which is one if inside another if statement. Today we're going to put one loop inside another. And at the end there's some optional stuff, the extras. So the nested loop, well, let me show you one. Here we have a for loop, and it is inside another for loop. How on earth does that work, you might ask? Well, the inner loop runs all of its iterations. It runs through the entire loop. Each time the outer loop runs once. So if the outer loop runs 5 times, the inner loop will do all its iterations each of those 5 times. To help clarify that, give it some meaning, let's go to the nested for box.java. So what we have a for loop here. So we have this integer stop equal to 6. This inside for loop goes from 1 to stop minus 1. So it goes from 1 to 5 and just prints the value. So it's going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What this outer loop does is take that whole thing and make it run multiple times. Okay. So it's going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over and over and over again. How many times? Well, it's going to go from 1 to 6. So it's going to run this entire loop, all of its iterations, 6 times. And this empty print line here just makes sure that each time this runs, the collection, everything it prints is on a separate line. So it'll print 1 through 5, go to a new line, print 1 through 5 again, and again. It'll do that 6 times. So the outer loop, again, is going to run 6 times. Okay? And each time it runs, the inner loop is going to run 5. So what you get is a box of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, each 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 comes from the inner loop, starting at 1 and going to 5. The fact that we have 6 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, is due to the outside loop. It's just saying whatever's in here, do it 6 times. What's in there? Well, it's a loop that runs 5. So this one actually runs a total of 30 times. That's why it prints 30 characters. Nope. Let's do this a little bit differently. Maybe it'll make more sense the second time around. But again, we're going to have an outside loop and an inner loop. This other nested for. And so again, to remind us how the for loop works, there's a start value, there's a stop value, and an increment for the outside loop. And there's also a start value, a stop value, and an increment for the inside loop. So what happens? Well, and we're going, the stop value is 4 this time. So what's going to happen? The value for outer is going to be 1 when we first go in. So it's going to print that the outer value equals 1. Then this loop's going to take over and print inner values from 1 all the way to 4. And this time it's going to be on different lines. When it's printed 1 through 4, we're going to put a blank line, start again. Now, to remind us, it's going to start again with the outer value being incremented. So it'll print outer equals 2. Run the entire inner loop. It'll run again with the outer value equal to 3. Run the entire inner loop. And last but not least, the outer value of 4, and it'll run the entire inner loop. Now, a bit abstract maybe, so let's run it. Let's see what that produces. So you've got the outer value of 1, and the inner loop runs all 4 times. The outer value increments. The inner loop runs all 4 times. Outer value increments. The inner loop runs all 4 times. Outer value increments once more. Inner loop runs all 4 times. The outer value increments one more time. At that point, the outer loop stops. And since that's no longer executing, we certainly no longer execute the inner loop. And we're completely done. So the outer loop, again, runs 1 through 4. Runs 4 times. The inner loop runs 1 through 4 for each of the outer loops. So it runs 4 times 4, 16 times. Oops. Giving you the output like so. Now, what makes things a little more fun is you can make a triangle out of it. Let's see exactly how that would happen. So, the outside loop, we're going to call it the row because it's going to put things into rows for us. It goes from 1 to 5. Now the columns, however, is going to change each time. The column starts at 1 and then only goes up until the value for row. So the first time we come in, row is equal to 1, it's going to print one thing. It's going to print what row we're in, and it's only going to print it once because row is equal to 1. We do it again, row is equal to 2, it's going to print the value for row twice. The value for row gets incremented. We're going to come in here, go from 1 to 3. We're going to print the value 3 times. Some of you don't believe me at this point, I'm sure. That's okay. That's why we have compiling. So, outer loop runs the first time, row is equal to 1. So the inner loop only operates one time, prints the value for row. Row gets incremented, so the inner loop is going to run for the values of 1 and 2, prints the value of row, which is 2, twice, etc., all the way up to 5, at which point it's going to print 5 things. The value of row is 5. And because the stop value for the column increases each time, we get more characters each time in each row. The stop value increases by 1, so the number of times it prints increases by 1. So, as a little diagram here, when we first go in, the value for R is 1. And the inner loop is only going to run one time, from 1 to 1. That's that part there. When we hit the bottom, R becomes 2, so the inner loop runs twice. That part there. Okay. And then the inner loop will try to run a third time, but 3 is bigger than 2, so nothing happens there. We start again with the value of R incremented to 3. The value for C is 1, 2, and 3. So it prints 3 times. And the value for C does go up to 4, but then that's too big, so it doesn't run. And finally, the value for R gets too big, so the entire thing stops running. The one we just had prints the value for r anywhere from 1 to 5 times. One super duper cool thing is this actually works backwards. So suppose instead of starting at the smallest value that row ever has, let's start at the biggest value. And reverse everything. Start at the biggest value and decrease by 1 each time, going down to the value for row. Any guesses as to what will happen? Well, first of all, there will be a typo. Stop. That's it. Any guesses as to what will happen when I start with the biggest value for the inner loop and decrease by 1 until I get to the smallest value? No guesses? Oh, that's too bad. Well, what will happen is that it prints the value for row, but it runs 5 times because it goes from 5 down to 1, 5 down to 2, 5 down to 3, 5 down to 4, so it runs twice, and last but not least, the stop and start value are both 5, so it runs exactly 1 time. So you can increase everything by 1, or you can decrease everything by 1. You still get a triangle. They're just reverses of each other. Last but not least, for the nested for loops, I want to do one with a string in it. A lot of the problems involving loops involve building strings one character at a time. Some of you saw this when you were working on the previous lab. If you want to build a string, and we will be writing lots of functions or methods that return a string, you start off with an empty string and then add one character at a time with the loop, and then what you get at the end is the total string that you're looking for, and you return it, or in this case we're just printing it out. So what's going to happen here? Well, we have this increasing by 1, so we have this output starts as an empty string. We go to the loop that controls the rows. We go into the inside loop. It goes from 1 to 1 because row is 1 the first time. And we add one less than symbol. The loop is done. We go to a new line. That's what the \n is for. Then we run the inner loop another time, but this time the value for row is 2, so we add 2 less than symbols. Go to a new line when the loop is done. Row is now 3. We're going to run this 3, so we're adding 3 less than symbols. Go to a new line, etc., all the way up to 11. So what we've done, and keep this in mind, this is how you build strings one character at a time. You'll see and write methods that do that all the time throughout the course. Right? The plus equals works for math and it works for strings. So I make a row of 1 less than symbol, then I make a row of 2 of them, I make a row of 3 of them. Right? It keeps building and building up via the outside loop, and then when the outside loop is done, I've got all these rows with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. less than symbols. What I get is, that. The first time the inner loop ran, I got 1 less than symbol. The second time it ran twice. Third time it ran, it got 3 times. All the way up to the 11th time it ran, where I got 11 less than symbols. So again, the plus makes it an ever-increasing size triangle. The row value tells us when to stop. And we're making a string this time instead of printing individual characters or a number. The plus equals just tacks on a new character each time. Last but not least, we can put a while loop inside of another while loop. I won't spend a lot of time because frankly it works the same way that a for loop does. So here's my inner loop. My value inner starts at 1, and this loop operates for as long as inner is less than or equal to 3 and increments by 1 each time. So inside I have a loop that operates 3 times for the values 1, 2, and 3. And it prints out the value for outer and the value for inner. What's the outer loop doing? The outer loop starts at 1 and works for as long as the outer value is less than or equal to 2 and increments 1 each time. So the inner value goes from 1 to 3. 1, 2, 3. The outer value has the values 1 and 2. So we get the inner loop operating for the outer value of 1, the inner loop operating for the outer value of 2, just like we did with the for loops. It's just written a little bit differently because while loop has the initialization, condition, and increment in separate places, but functionally it's working the same way. So one while loop inside of another. The inner loop operates 3 times. That's why we get the 1, 2, 3 here for the inner value. The outer loop operates 2 times. Right? That's why we get 2 sets. Do while loop is, well, it's set up the same way. The inner do while loop goes from 1 to 3. So it's going to print the inner value is going to go from 1 to 3. Okay. The outside loop goes from 1 to 2. So it's going to print 2 sets of that, just like the other one did. It's just that the format of the loop is a little bit different because it's a do while loop, but it does the same thing. The outer value is 1, the inner value goes 1, 2, 3. The outer value is 2, the inner value goes 1, 2, 3. And that's, so again, they work functionally the same as a for loop. We're just using a while loop to simulate it. So what I want you to do now is go to the Check for Understanding worksheet, answer the questions. In that same folder, you've also got the answers. You can check that. If you have any questions, bring them to me in class. Otherwise, next time I see you in class, we're going to be doing problems A, B, C, D, F, and J from the Lab 11. If you wish to look at some more ways of controlling loops, there's 2 statements, the break and continue statement. They are not part of the APCS CompSci curriculum, but as you progress in programming skills, you will see them in more complicated programs. If you wish to take a look at them, you may find it interesting. But that's entirely up to you. It's not at all required part of the course. Thanks for visiting. Have an excellent day, and see you next time.